She came to the mountain expecting to die. Not quickly, not mercifully. She expected to be dragged into a cold stone hall, thrown at the feet of some nameless barbarian, and used until she broke. The rumors in Tretogor had been specific about that much. The Wolf Lord's men were beasts. Their women were livestock. Their marriages were consummated in public, before the whole pack, like animals in a field. Melena de Rawgiven, third daughter of the Duke of Rawgiven, had believed every word. The road climbed in a series of brutal switchbacks carved into the mountainside, too steep for wagons, too narrow for comfort. 3 mules carried everything she owned. 3 knights escorted her, though none of them had spoken more than a handful of words in the week since they had left Tretogor. They rode ahead, behind, beside her, but never with her. They kept her mare on a leading rein, as though she were a child, or a parcel, or a thing too fragile to be trusted with her own direction. She understood why. If they spoke to her, they would have to look at her. And if they looked at her, they would have to acknowledge what they were doing. Delivering a 19-year-old girl to a fortress full of monsters, to be married to whichever monster the Wolf Lord saw fit to choose. The keep revealed itself slowly, as the road crested the final ridge. It was enormous, easily as large as the palace in Tretogor, but where the palace wore its grandeur like silk, Kaer Morhen wore its purpose like iron. No banners, no flower boxes, no gardens. Just dark stone, sheer walls, and a silence so complete it pressed against her eardrums like deep water. Melena counted 3 places along the road where a rockfall could seal the path entirely, one bridge over a chasm that could be shattered with a single well-placed blow. If the keep had its own water source, and food enough, it could outlast any siege in the history of the world. She was not being brought to a home. She was being brought to a weapon. The gate opened with a groan of iron, and a single figure stepped out. He was tall, taller than any of the knights, broader too, with shoulders that seemed carved from the same dark stone as the walls behind him. He wore plain leather armor, well worn, unadorned, and a sword hilt jutted above one shoulder. His hair was braided back tight, his skin tanned to a deep mahogany. A single silver pendant hung at his throat. Then he drew closer, and Melena saw the things that made him not a man. The scar that wound down one side of his face, barely missing the eye, curling his lip into a permanent snarl. The eyes themselves, a shade of deep yellow gold that did not exist in any human face she had ever seen. The way he moved, not walking so much as prowling, each step placed with the liquid precision of something that hunted for a living. He stopped 10 paces from the lead knight and spoke a single word of greeting. His voice was deep, rough, like gravel dragged over stone. The knight's voice shook when he answered, saying they had come escorting Lady Melena de Rawgiven to seal the treaty between King Vizimir and the Wolf Lord. The barbarian's gaze moved past the knight and found Melena. His eyes were slitted like a cat's. She felt them on her skin like the touch of a blade. She did not look away. She could not. After a long, long moment, he nodded and told them they had best come in. They called him Eskel. He was the Wolf Lord's second in command, and he was, to Melena's stunned and disoriented mind, almost kind. He had a scar that turned his smile into something terrible, and his teeth were sharper than they should be, but he bowed when he greeted her, and he told her not to worry, that it would not be as bad as she was fearing. He could not promise that. She knew he could not promise that. But it was the first gentle thing anyone had said to her in weeks, and she held on to it like a drowning woman holds a rope. A girl named Julita came to help her bathe and dress. She was human, golden-haired, cheerful, and built like a blacksmith's daughter, with arms that could probably bend iron. She chattered about bread and baking and the midsummer festival, and she said, with easy confidence, that most of the wolf blood were all bark and no bite. Melena wanted to believe her. She could not. They dressed her in blue silk, her own embroidery along the hems, silver and sapphire jewelry at her throat and wrists. She looked, Julita said, like a queen. Melena felt like a sacrifice. The great hall was vast and cold and full of people, hundreds of them, Mao, wolf blood and human alike, packed along 7 long tables. The noise of them, a wall of sound that hit Melena like a physical force. She stood in the doorway on Eskel's arm and could not breathe. And then the hall went silent, and the Wolf Lord spoke. He was not the largest man in the room, not the broadest, but he drew the eye like a flame draws moths. His hair was white as bone, his eyes a pure, true gold, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that every soul in that hall leaned forward to hear it. He announced that this was Melena de Rawgiven, daughter of the Duke of Rawgiven. She would marry Lambert of the Wolves, tonight, with them all to witness. A single word came back from almost 1,000 throats. Wolf. And the word carried a weight of fealty so heavy that Melena swayed on her feet. And then she saw him. He stood beside the wolf lord, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the color of fire and eyes the shade of topazes. A long-heeled scar ran down the left side of his face, crossing the eyebrow. His tunic was green so deep it was nearly black, utterly unadorned, and his belt carried a startling number of daggers. His arms were crossed over his broad chest. He was scowling. He looked furious. He looked like a man who had been ordered to do something he despised, and who would do it anyway, and who would hate every single moment of it. Milena thought with perfect clarity that she prayed to every god she knew that he would not take that anger out on her. The ceremony was brief. A priestess rushed through the words. Milena spoke her vows in a voice that did not shake, because she was a duke's daughter and she would not show her fear. Lambert spoke his in a low, furious murmur that made her want to run. He held out his hand. She put hers into it. His palm was warm, heavily calloused, and astonishingly gentle as his fingers closed around hers. The priestess wound the golden ribbon around their joined hands, tied the ceremonial knot, spoke the final words. Milena was married. And then Lambert drew a knife. Milena squeaked. She could not help it. The blade appeared in his free hand as though conjured from thin air, and every horrible story she had ever heard about barbarian wedding rites flashed through her mind in a single, searing instant. Lambert paused. He looked at her, and then he said, in a voice flat with exhaustion and irritation, that he needed to get this fucking thing off, and how else was he supposed to do it? He meant the ribbon. The golden wedding ribbon, which tradition dictated should be worn through the feast, untied only by the bride's hand. He did not know the tradition, or he did not care. Milena reached out with trembling fingers and undid the knot. The ribbon coiled in her palm, light as a whisper. She tucked it into her sleeve. She did not cry. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood, and she did not cry. He filled her plate at dinner. That was the thing she did not expect. Lambert yanked her chair out for her, shoved it into place with one hand when she could not move it, and then began loading her trencher with venison, stewed greens, chicken, boar with plums. More food than she could eat in 2 days. She told him, very quietly, that it was more than enough. He glowered at her and told her to eat what she could, that he would finish the rest. And he did. When she set down her utensils, he pulled her trencher in front of himself and cleaned it with the efficient, unhurried thoroughness of a man who had never in his life wasted a meal. The food was, impossibly, extraordinary, better than anything she had eaten in Tretogor. Perfectly cooked, beautifully spiced, the bread light as air with a crust that shattered between her teeth. She ate in silence, surrounded by barbarians, and could not reconcile the two facts. He led her to his rooms afterward, not the guest chambers. A sitting room with weapon racks along 2 walls, a shelf of books she had not expected, a large fireplace banked to glowing coals, and beyond a half-open door, a bed large enough for 3. Her baggage was already there, stacked neatly beneath the window. She stood in the center of the room and did not know what to do. She did not know what was expected of her. She did not know if she was meant to go to the bedroom, or wait for instruction, or begin unpacking, or kneel. Lambert told her to sit down and dropped into one of the chairs by the fire. He drew a dagger and began flipping it in one hand, not watching the blade as it arced through the air. It was not a threat. It was a habit, an idle motion like another man might drum his fingers, but it felt like a threat. It felt like the whole world was a threat. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. Lambert spoke at last. He flung the knife. It struck the bullseye of a target on the wall. He had not even looked. He told her he was pretty sure he was going to be a shitty husband. He was absolutely sure he was not what she wanted. Milena started to protest, to call him her lord husband, but he cut her off with a snarl. His yellow eyes caught the firelight with an unnatural glow. He told her not to lie to him. Milena flinched back in her chair. Her whole body went cold. He stared at her for a moment. Then his shoulders slumped. He looked away. His voice dropped. He told her not to call him lord. He was not a lord. None of them were. Not really. She did not know what to say. She said nothing. After a long silence, she ventured that traditionally, in Redania, it was a husband's duty to protect and provide for his wife. Lambert said he could not do the last bit. He was sterile. All wolf blood were. She blinked. In Redania, the mere suggestion that a nobleman could not sire heirs would be scandal beyond scandal. Here, he said it like he was commenting on the weather. But protect and provide, he continued. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. And then he did something she would remember for the rest of her life. He drew another dagger. He pressed the tip to his own forearm and drew it down, leaving a long, thin line of blood. He held the bloody blade out to her, hilt first. He told her he would never hurt her. His voice was low and fierce, and his eyes were almost blazing. He swore it on his blood and steel. And if he ever did raise his hand to her, she should stab him for it. Milena stared at him. She stared at the dagger. She stared at the blood on his arm, already beginning to close, already healing, because of course it was, because he was wolf blood, because nothing about this world obeyed the rules she had been taught. She reached out and wrapped her hand around the hilt. It was too large for her fingers. She almost dropped it. He observed that she did not know how to use it. She whispered that she did not. He said he could teach her. And then, as though the words embarrassed him, he added that it was only if she wanted. No nobleman in Redania had ever offered to teach his bride to use a weapon. No nobleman in Redania had ever offered his bride the means to kill him if he broke his word. The thought was so far outside anything she had been raised to expect that her mind simply stopped, hung suspended in the space between terror and something she could not yet name. She thanked him. She told him she would like that a great deal. He offered her a smile. It was small, tentative, and it made his scarred face look almost young. He slept on the hearth that night, not in the bed, not in the sitting room chairs. He dragged a blanket from a storage chest, spread it on the rug before the dying fire, and lay down with his back to the bedroom door, between her and the rest of the world. He told her he was not going to hurt her, not going to force her. Not now, not ever. He told her to go to sleep. He would stay out here. Milena stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she went back inside, took the heaviest blanket from the bed, folded it carefully, and padded back out. He was sitting by the coals, flipping another knife, his head turning at the sound of her approach. His yellow eyes caught the faint light and glowed, uncanny and watchful. She whispered that she had brought a blanket for him, husband, and held it out. He took it. He looked at her as though she had handed him something impossible. She wished him good night. He said good night back. She closed the door. She curled up under the covers. She pressed her face into the pillow and breathed. Not gonna hurt you. Not gonna force you. Not now. Not ever. I swear it on my blood and steel. She fell asleep with his promise echoing through her mind, and her dreams were full of yellow eyes. On the other side of the door, Lambert lay on the hearthrug and listened to his wife's breathing slow into sleep. Wife. He had a wife. A tiny, bird-boned, terrified noblewoman who smelled like roses and fear, and who had just brought him a blanket because she had noticed he did not have one. He was not a good man. He knew that. He was foul-mouthed, short-tempered, and about as suited to marriage as a sword was suited to embroidery. Eskel had picked him for this, and Lambert still did not understand why. He understood why he had married her. The treaty. Geralt and Eskel asked, and Lambert did not say no to Geralt and Eskel. That was simple. What was not simple was the way she had looked at him when he had handed her the dagger. Not with gratitude exactly, with something closer to wonder. As though no one had ever offered her the right to defend herself before. As though no one had ever thought she deserved it. He turned his head and stared at the sword above the mantel. Aiden's sword. 3 years gone and still hanging there because Lambert could not bring himself to take it down and could not bring himself to look at it, and so it stayed, gleaming in the dark, a wound that would not close. Aiden would have known what to say. Aiden would have made her laugh. Yeah. Aiden could charm the fear out of anyone with a grin and a terrible joke, and the easy grace of a man who had never once in his life been cruel on purpose. Aiden was dead, and Lambert was here, on a hearthrug, married to a girl who was still scared enough to make his skin crawl with the bitter stink of it. He pulled the blanket she had given him up to his chin. It smelled faintly of roses. He whispered into the empty room, asking Aiden what the hell he was supposed to do now. The fire crackled. The sword gleamed. The girl slept, and the mountain held them all, silent and vast and indifferent, as it had held everything for 1,000 years and would hold everything for 1,000 more. But the mountain, it turned out, was not done with either of them. The days that followed were a slow unraveling of everything Milena thought she knew. Zofia came the next morning, a stocky, square-built woman with brown hair cropped to her jawline and solemn brown eyes, wearing well-used leather armor with a sword at her side. He was human. She was also, unmistakably, a warrior. She told Milena that Lambert had asked her to show the new bride around, and she said it with the same blunt practicality she might have used to describe the weather. She led Milena down 6 flights of stairs, into the earth itself, to a vast cavern where hot springs bubbled up from the mountain's heart and spilled down through more than a dozen basins of steaming water. She explained that everyone bathed here, men and women alike, every day, because wolf blood has sensitive noses and the keep was kept clean by necessity. She pointed out the line of lighter stone inlaid into the floor, above which the water was hot enough to burn. She showed Milena the baskets for laundry, the shells of soap shaped like roses in bloom, the brass mirrors. And then, in that warm cavern, with steam curling around them like living things, Zofia told Milena the most important thing she would ever learn about the wolf blood. They did not lie. They might use only part of the truth. They might refuse to answer. But they did not lie. And the other half of that rule was that they could tell if you did. They could smell it. They could smell a lot of things. Sickness, injury, emotions. Which meant they all knew Milena was terrified. Which meant every polite little flattery, every white lie, every careful half-truth she had learned at the court in Tretogor was not just useless here. It was dangerous. Milena swallowed hard and decided, in that steaming cavern, that she would have to unlearn a lifetime of habits. Zofia also told her that the people who thrived in Kaer Morhen were the ones with something to do. So Milena listed what she could do. Embroidery, the lap harp, a little, salves and lotions in a still room, a fine hand for writing, accounts. Zofia raised an eyebrow and said that all of it was useful. She suggested Milena talk to the steward about helping with the accounts, and offered to bring one of her good tunics for Milena to embroider. When Milena asked what she would like on it, Zofia's eyes went distant for a moment, and then she said softly, "Flowers. Any kind." Many kind. Milena would later learn why. She would learn that Zofia had a sister named Anna, 10 years younger, sweet as midsummer, who had been taken by a king and never returned. That Zofia had become a mercenary to earn a dowry for a sister who would never need one. That she had come to Kaer Morhen following the man who helped her bury Anna, the man who would become the Wolf Lord. And that the flowers she asked for, daisies and white heather and forget-me-nots, were the ones Anna used to stitch on all her clothes. But that was later. For now, Milena simply nodded and said she could do that, and Zofia smiled, and something shifted between them that felt like the first thread of a bond neither of them had expected. Stuart Kellner, when Milena went to him, listened to her list of accomplishments and told her that the most useful thing she could do was help Eskel with the diplomatic correspondence. None of the wolf blood had any training in the doublespeak of kings, he explained. They were warriors, not courtiers. And until Milena's arrival, there had been no nobles among them who could parse the hidden meanings in a royal letter. Milena was stunned. She had expected to be decorative, a treaty bride, a symbol, a body to be used and discarded. Instead, she was being handed the keys to the Wolf Lord's foreign policy. She went to Eskel's office and found a room in absolute chaos. Papers heaped head-high on the desk and all over a large table in the middle of the floor. Sheaves of parchment stacked on shelves. An enormous map covered in pinned notes hanging between two windows. Eskel stood in the middle of it all, looking rueful, and admitted that he had been trying to make it up as he went, but it was starting to get the better of him. Milena swallowed hard, knotted her fingers in her skirts for courage, and said that she was trained for this, that she could help him organize it, if he would allow. Eskel's scarred face broke into a grin so wide it was almost hideous, and he said he would thank her on his damn knees. And so, Milena de Roggevin, third daughter of a duke, treaty bride to a barbarian, began her first day of work in the office of the Wolf Lord's second-in-command. She picked up a stack of papers at random and began to read, and found, to her surprised pleasure, that they were organized by topic and chronology, which would make her future efforts much easier. She was still reading when the door opened, and Lambert stood framed in the doorway. He looked awkward, rather than angry, which was a new expression for him. He asked if she was done for the day. Eskel chuckled and shooed them both out, saying she had been there for 3 hours and should go do something that was not despairing over his so-called organizational system. Lambert led her down several hallways to a plain iron-bound door, which opened into a vast armory. Racks upon racks of daggers in every imaginable shape and size, swords in every length and style, crossbows and longbows, and huge baskets of bolts and arrows. He asked to see her hand. She held it out. He took it astonishingly gently, cradling it in one big palm. His hands were half again the size of hers, heavily calloused and surprisingly warm. He studied her fingers for a moment, then turned to one of the racks and plucked down a pair of knives. The one he handed her was a beautiful, delicate little dagger, the blade watered steel, the hilt wrapped in what she thought might actually be sharkskin, with a small blue stone set in the pommel. The blade's edges gleamed in the lantern light, far sharper than her eating knives had ever been. He showed her how to hold it. She adjusted her grip until it looked like his, and the dagger settled a little more comfortably into her hand. He nodded and said it looked like about the right size. Then he led her down 2 flights of stairs to a room she had not expected to find in a fortress of wolf blood, a salle, a practice room, with benches along the walls and targets and a smooth stone floor. He told her they would start with footwork. He eyed her skirts for a moment and said that normally he would say she should wear trousers, but if she had to stab someone, they were not going to wait for her to go and get changed, so she had better learn in skirts. She demonstrated the stance he showed her, and felt like she might fall over if she moved. He frowned and crouched down, eyeing her feet, and she stomped on her own sense of propriety and tucked her skirts up a bit so he could see better. Lift foot out a little. Bend the knees more. And then, suddenly, it clicked. She said, with genuine surprise, that it was like dancing. Lambert blinked up at her from where he was still crouched on the floor. He said he guessed it was, sure. Malena smiled and shifted her weight slightly until she was poised the way she would be on a dance floor, ready to answer to her partner's slightest cue. Lambert cocked his head a little, as if surprised, and then rose and took up a position about 2 arms' length away from her. He told her to keep this distance and began to move. Malena watched his chest and kept her steps light and easy as she echoed his motions. Forward and left, back and right, around and about in no particular pattern, slowly enough that she could keep up without too much difficulty. It really was a little like a dance. He stopped just when Malena was starting to think she was going to need to ask for a break, and she raised her eyes to his, wondering what she was going to see. He was not angry, as far as she could tell. Certainly, his scowl was nowhere to be found. Instead, he was regarding her with something like curiosity. He said she must be a pretty damn good dancer. Malena could feel her cheeks flushing. She admitted that she was accounted quite skilled, yes. He said, with visible hesitation, that he could not dance, not the fancy court kind. And then, as though the words cost him something, he added that he could learn. Malena swallowed. She said she would be honored to teach him, husband. He eyed her like he thought she might be lying, then offered her another of those tiny, tentative smiles. He said they could switch off, maybe. Daggers one day, dancing the next. She agreed that would suit her very well. He said, yeah, me too. And then he looked rather astonished at himself. They went to dinner. He walked her to the hall and filled her plate and sat beside her and did not scowl at her, not once. And when she glanced sideways at him, she caught him watching the dances in the cleared space below the high table with an expression she could not quite read. Not anger, not boredom, something closer to longing. That night, he slept on the hearth again, and the night after that, and the night after that, and slowly, so slowly she almost did not notice it happening, the fear began to drain away. It was not one moment. It was 100 small ones. The way he learned her food preferences and never put anything on her trencher that she did not like. The way he made sure she got a share of even the most hotly contested desserts. The way he filled her trencher at every meal without even seeming to notice that he was doing it. The way he walked on her left side in the corridors, between her and the wall, without ever mentioning it. It was the way he asked Zofia to show her around, because he knew she was scared of him and did not blame her for it. The way he asked Julita to help her bathe, because he knew the hot springs would be too much, too soon. The way he moved his own wardrobe out of the bedroom so she would have the room to herself, and set up a cot in the sitting room so he would not have to sleep on the hearth rug, and never once mentioned that he had done either. It was the way he taught her footwork with infinite patience, correcting her with gentle hands, never raising his voice, never showing frustration. And the way he let her teach him to dance, standing in the salle with his hand in hers, following her lead with the same focused intensity he brought to a sparring match, and grinning down at her when they moved in perfect unison, all teeth and glee, as though he had discovered something wonderful and could not quite believe it was real. It was the way he flipped a dagger idly in his hand while she embroidered by the fire in the evenings and told her stories about monsters and mountains and the strange, fierce, beautiful world of the wolf blood, and listened to her stories in return, about court life and embroidery and a kitten named Lionors, with the same rapt attention he gave to a hunting report. And it was the way he looked at her, sometimes, when he thought she was not watching, not with hunger, not with anger, with something softer, something almost like wonder, as though he could not quite believe she was real, or that she was his, or that she had not run screaming into the night. Malena noticed all of it. She catalogued every kindness, every small grace, every moment of unexpected tenderness, and she held them up against the fear like a candle held up against the dark, and slowly, slowly, the dark began to recede. She still flinched sometimes, still bit the inside of her cheek when she was anxious, still woke from dreams of yellow eyes and huge, warm hands, and the terrible, wonderful feeling of being held by something that could crush her, but chose, instead, to be gentle. But the flinching grew less frequent. The cheek-biting grew rarer. And one evening, 3 weeks after her arrival, she was sitting in her chair by the fire, embroidering flowers onto a dark brown tunic for Zofia, and Lambert was on the floor at her feet, flipping a dagger and telling her about the time he and Aiden had tracked what they thought was a griffin and turned out to be barnacle geese, and she laughed. Not a polite little giggle, not a courtly titter behind her hand. A real laugh, bright and startled and entirely unguarded, and it filled the room like sunlight filling a window. Lambert stopped talking. He looked up at her. And the expression on his face was so open, so startled, so quietly delighted that Malena felt something shift in her chest, some lock turning, some door opening that she had not known was closed. he said very softly. That she had a nice laugh, she said very softly, that he had not heard it before because she had been too frightened to laugh. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, even more softly, that he was glad she was not frightened anymore. And Milena looked down at him, this big, scarred, foul-mouthed, impossibly gentle man, sitting on her floor with a dagger in his hand and firelight in his hair. And she thought, with a clarity that felt like the first clear breath after a long illness, that she was going to be all right. That night, for the first time, she did not lock the bedroom door. And Lambert, who could hear the click of a lock from 3 rooms away, who could smell the difference between a door that was closed and a door that was barred, heard the absence of that small, sharp sound, and lay on his cot in the sitting room and stared at the ceiling and felt his heart do something complicated and terrifying and wonderful. He whispered to the dark, to the sword above the mantel, to the ghost of a cat with green eyes and a wicked grin, that he thought maybe, just maybe, he was not going to fuck this up after all. The sword gleamed. The fire crackled. The girl slept, and the mountain held them, as it always had, as it always would, patient and vast and indifferent to the small, fierce, tender things that grew in its shadow, but it held them nonetheless. And that, Melina would later think, was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The weeks that followed were, by any honest accounting, the happiest Lambert had known in 3 years. He learned to dye thread. This was, in itself, absurd. Lambert of the Wolves, who could field strip a crossbow in under a minute, who had once climbed the sheer eastern face of the Kestrel Peaks with nothing but his bare hands and a very bad attitude, who brewed compounds that could dissolve bone or mend it depending on the dosage, who had spent the better part of 2 decades hunting monsters through mountain passes that would kill an ordinary man in an afternoon. Lambert of the Wolves had taken up dyeing thread. He learned it from a seamstress named Jenny, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the sewing room while she explained mordants and fixatives and the precise temperature at which madder root released its red. He learned that stale urine made a decent mordant, but that alum was better and smelled considerably less like death. He learned that woad gave blue, that onion skins gave a perfectly acceptable yellow, that verdigris and piss and alum together produced a blue-green so beautiful it made him sit back on his heels and stare at the hank of thread in his hands like he had just pulled a living thing out of the void. He hung the hanks along one wall of the little shed behind the smithy and watched the rainbow grow. Melina did not know. Melina spent her mornings in Eskel's office, sorting diplomatic correspondence into neat chronological ledgers, drafting replies in her careful, elegant hand, teaching old Keldar and Barman how to maintain the system so that Eskel's desk would not once again become a paper avalanche. She spent her afternoons in the salle, learning footwork with a dagger in her hand, her skirts swirling around her ankles as she mirrored Lambert step for step. She spent her evenings curled in her chair by the fire, embroidering flowers onto tunics and scarves and ribbons, while Lambert sat at her feet and told her stories about wyverns and Illyrians and the time he and Aiden had tracked what they thought was a griffin and turned out to be barnacle geese. And she was happy. Lambert could smell it. Happiness on Melena was a bright, sweet thing, like sunlight on warm bread, and it filled their rooms every evening until Lambert thought his heart might crack open from the sheer force of it. He was not going to fall in love with her. He had decided that very firmly, the first night he had carried her sleeping form from the chair to the bed and tucked the blankets around her and whispered goodnight to the dark. He was not going to fall in love. He had loved Aiden, and Aiden was dead, and Lambert's heart was a scarred and battered thing that had no business opening itself up again. He told this to the sword above the mantel every night. The sword did not answer. The sword gleamed, and Lambert whispered to it, and somewhere in the mountains he was almost sure Aiden was laughing at him. The thread was ready on a Tuesday. Melina came back from Eskel's office smelling sad. Not frightened, not angry, just sad. A wet, mulchy sort of sadness that made Lambert's chest ache in a way he could not name. He took her hand and led her out of the keep, around to the sheds behind the smithy, and opened the door. She stopped dead in the doorway. The wall was hung with thread, dozens of hanks, in every color Lambert had managed to produce. Deep reds and bright blues and soft greens and a purple so rich it looked like crushed violets. Gold and silver and black and white and every shade between. Enough thread to keep her embroidering for months. Melina turned to look at him, and her eyes were wet, and her sin was shock and confusion and a rising, incandescent joy. "Did you?" she said. "Did you dye me thread?" Lambert said, scrubbing a hand across the back of his neck. She cried. She cried, and then she threw her arms around his waist and pressed her face against the front of his tunic and laughed into the fabric, muffled and bright, and Lambert stood there with his arms hovering uselessly in the air, utterly poleaxed, until she pulled back and looked up at him with wet cheeks and a smile so radiant it hurt to look at. And then she went up on her toes and pressed a kiss to his cheek. It was brief. It was soft. It was damp with tears and tasted of salt, and it landed just below his scar, right on the ridge of his cheekbone, and Lambert stood there with his hand not quite touching the spot and stared after her as she went in to admire the thread. He did not move for a very long time. That night, Melina kissed him on the cheek again before she went to bed. And the night after that, and the night after that, it became a thing. A small, sweet, steady thing, like a candle being lit in a dark room, one flame at a time. Lambert kissed her hand every afternoon when he collected her from Eskel's office. He pressed his lips to her knuckles, light as a feather, and watched her ears go pink, and pretended not to notice the way her scent spiked with something warm and fluttering that might have been lust if it were not so tender. He told himself he was not falling in love. He told the sword. He told the fire. He told the empty air where Aiden should have been. He was lying, and he knew it, and he did not care. The midsummer festival came on the longest day of the year. Everyone rose late. There was no training. The wolf blood trickled out of their rooms around lunchtime, sleep mussed and grinning, and the great hall filled with the smell of cold meats and fresh bread, and the particular giddy energy of 100 warriors who had been told they did not have to fight anything today. Melina had made Julita a dress. Wheat stalks embroidered all around the hem, rising almost to the bodice, and a neckline adorned with lace that looked like rippling flames. Julita received it with delighted wonder and many thanks, and Sophia watched with a proud, fierce smile, and Melina beamed as though she had just been handed a crown. In the afternoon, the wolf blood gathered on the fields behind the keep. Zia, the fierce little manticore candidate, took her oath in the old wolf blood tongue, coached by Aaron, her clan father, and received her medallion from Merton's hands, and the gathered wolf blood let out a great bellowing cheer that rang from the mountainside. Zia looked happy enough to cry, and then the sun set, and someone cast a burning brand into the enormous pile of wood, and the wolf blood began to dance. Melina had seen them dance before, in the great hall, lit by lanterns, but this was different. Out here beneath the darkening sky, lit by the bonfire's flickering flames, with the drums pounding a steady, throbbing beat and the chant rising in the old tongue, the wolf blood became something more than beautiful. They became something wild and wondrous, dangerous and compelling, leaping and twirling and flipping in ever-shifting patterns like the ebb and flow of an endless sea. And Lambert was among them. He had cast off his tunic. His skin shone with sweat in the firelight, his scars like silver, his hair like flames. He leaped higher than the others, stomped harder, flipped more elegantly, and when he landed, the ground seemed to shake. Melina could not look away. She did not want to look away. The dance ended with a great baying cry that echoed off the mountainside, and then the wolf blood dispersed, laughing and clapping each other on the back, and Lambert came to Melina with his teeth gleaming in the twilight and his eyes bright as topazes. "Hey," he said. Melina could not find words. She went up on her tiptoes, hands braced on his bare chest, and kissed him as sweetly as she could. His skin was hot and smooth and slightly slick with sweat beneath her hands. Lambert made a startled noise and wrapped his hands around her waist and kissed back. "Guess you liked the dancing then," he said, chuckling when she finally broke away. "It was glorious," Melina said. "You were glorious." Lambert's grin got toothier. He kissed her again, swift and sweet, and then leaned back, fumbling in his belt pouch. Midsummer's a time for gifts, yeah?" Melina nodded, wondering. She had a tunic finished for him, decorated with roses wound around swords, but she had not expected anything from him. He had already given her so much. Lambert took a deep breath. "I really fucking hope I haven't fucked this up. I saw that ribbon in with your pretty things. The wedding ribbon, yeah?" Melina nodded again. He pulled something out of his belt pouch and held it out, almost tentatively. It was the golden ribbon that had married them, wound around and through a delicate silver chain, and strung on them both, a silver medallion, half the size of the one about Lambert's throat, engraved with a wolf's head. "I want everyone to know what you are to me," Lambert said very quietly. "Not part of a treaty, not something Geralt and Eskel asked of me, not an obligation. A choice. My wife, by both our wills. Will you? Would you like that?" Melina felt the moment that affection and desire turned, all in a single heartbeat, into love. "I will gladly wear your token, husband," she said. Lambert's eyes went huge and dark. He lifted the necklace and clasped it around her throat. The pendant thumped gently against her breastbone, a slight cool weight, and Melina shivered, not in fear, in something far sweeter. "Lambert," she said, and reached up to cradle his cheek in her palm. "Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. I will respect, honor, and love you, and I will not part from you all the days of my life." "Oh," Lambert whispered. "This." Milena laughed, and Lambert flushed bright red and laughed too. And it was not the wedding she had thought she would have as a child, and it was not the wedding she had actually had, shaking with terror in a cold stone hall, but it was her true wedding all the same. This joyful moment in the light of a midsummer fire, with her husband's pendant cool against her skin, and her husband's laughter better than any music she had ever heard. "Husband," she said, grinning, made wild and brave by the night and the laughter and the necklace clasped about her throat. "Husband, take me to bed." "Oh," Lambert said, and swooped her up into his arms and kissed her. And that night, for the first time, Milena de Rogiven, treaty bride, third daughter of a duke, woman of Kaer Morhen, lay beneath her husband and learned that his mouth was as clever as his hands, that his growls were low and pleased and not frightening at all, that his strength could be a shelter rather than a threat, and that the sound she made when he brought her over her first peak was not a scream of pain but a startled, breathless little cry of joy. And afterwards, curled in his arms with the kitten purring on the pillow beside them, Lambert whispered, "I love you," into her hair. And Milena smiled against his shoulder and whispered it back, and the fire crackled, and the sword gleamed above the mantle, and the mountain held them. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after midsummer, when the world broke open. Lambert was in the dye shed, elbow deep in a vat of something that smelled like rotten eggs and regret, trying to coax a more color-fast purple out of a mixture of crushed shells and iron filings. Milena was in Eskel's office, drafting a reply to a rather tedious inquiry from the Archduke of Kaedwen about grain tariffs. Aiden was dead, and had been dead for 3 years, and the sword above the mantel gleamed in the empty rooms, and everything was as it should be. And then someone screamed in the courtyard. Not a scream of pain, a scream of shock, of disbelief. The kind of sound a person makes when the laws of the world have just been violated in front of their eyes. Lambert left his dye vat and went trotting out to see what was up. He shoved his way through the ring of gawking wolf blood, and then he skidded to a halt. There was a body on a litter in the middle of the courtyard, a breathing body, chest rising and falling far too slowly, but in a steady rhythm all the same. It was far too skinny, and so dirty he could not see the proper color of the skin, and the hair and beard were horrid matted tangles. But all the same, it was a body Lambert knew as well as he knew his own. He could not move. He felt like he had been struck by lightning or turned to stone, and there was a strange, high, keening noise filling his ears, one he could not quite place. He had never heard a monster make that noise. It took him a moment to realize the keening was coming from his own throat. "He got hurt," Geralt's voice, cutting through the sound, a big hand on his shoulder. "He got hurt." Footsteps, lighter than any wolf bloods, pattering against the stone. And then Milena was there, shoving Geralt aside, dropping to her knees in front of Lambert, slender hands cradling his face. "Lambert, what's wrong?" Lambert could only find a single word, a name that fell from his lips like a prayer to some capricious god. Milena glanced up at the Wolf Lord, who nodded confirmation. Somehow, impossibly, this was Lambert's Aiden. "Hello." Triss was summoned. Letho and Aubrey carried the litter inside. Milena took Lambert's hands in hers and rose to her feet, tugging gently. He stumbled after her, moving like a puppet with tangled strings. She did not dare let go. Lambert clutched at her hands, almost too tightly, and he was so pale she was genuinely worried he was going to faint. She walked slowly backwards, leading him in the wake of the litter as the wolf blood parted to let them through. Eskel and the Wolf Lord fell in beside them, and Milena steered Lambert all the way to the sick room and managed to get him into a chair before his knees gave out. She did not know what to do. No etiquette book in the world had ever covered what to do when one's husband's dead lover turned out to not be dead. But Lambert looked like he was about to faint or burst into tears, so Milena did the only thing she could think of. She climbed into his lap, tugging his head down to cradle it against her shoulder. Lambert was utterly still for a moment, and then his arms came around her and he clung like a drowning man to a lifeline, and she could feel hot tears against her skin. Triss worked for hours. She cleaned wounds, set bones, stitched gashes, applied salves and bandages. She worked with a focused, furious efficiency that Milena had never seen from her before. And slowly, under Triss's hands, the shape of what had been done to Aiden became clear. His feet were masses of bandaging, the skin flayed raw from running barefoot over who knew how many miles of wilderness. 8 of his fingers were splintered. His left leg was broken. Thick rings of bandaging circled his wrists and ankles where manacles had bitten in. There were gashes across his torso, deep and parallel, spaced out with a sickening regularity that Triss called torture marks without any hesitation. And there was a bandage wound around his head, entirely covering his right eye. He was very skinny, far more so than he ought to be. And there were more scars on the skin Milena could see than she had seen on any other wolf blood, silvery lines and what almost looked like patterns. but his chest was rising and falling, slow and steady, and Milena could not see any fresh blood leaking through the bandages. He would live. Milena went to the pantry and brought back a basket of food, bread and ham and cheese and a little pot of jam. She fed Lambert a sandwich piece by piece because he would not have eaten otherwise. She fed the wolf lord too, who sat in a chair beside Aiden's bed and watched everything with worried golden eyes. She fed Aiden broth, dripping it carefully into his mouth with a spouted cup, and he swallowed, and did not wake, but he swallowed. And then she sat on a cot in the corner and took out her embroidery, and tried very hard to concentrate on tiny, even stitches, and not the slow, shaky rhythm of Aiden's breath. It was a very, very strange night. Milena sat up sewing until her eyes grew too heavy, and then packed her basket up and curled up on the cot. The wolf lord gave Lambert a meaningful look and tilted his head at her. Lambert glanced from Milena to Aiden and back again several times before he nodded and lay down beside her, curling around her and pressing his face against her hair. "Don't deserve you," he muttered. "Diaz." "It's not about deserving," Milena murmured sleepily. She woke some uncounted time later to the sound of someone whimpering, high and shrill. Lambert almost vaulted out of the cot, falling to his knees beside the figure on the bed. "Nightmare," the wolf lord said. "Help me keep him still." Aiden thrashed. His arms were rigid at his sides, as though they had been strapped there, his hands curled into tight fists. He was making a low, keening sound through clenched teeth, desperate and miserable. Milena scrambled out of the cot, fumbling blindly in her embroidery basket for a scrap of spare cloth. She scrubbed the cloth hard through Lambert's hair, and then fumbled up the bed to stick it as close as she could get it to Aiden's nose. Aiden heaved in a desperate breath, straining against the other wolf-blood's hands, and then went still. "Gariad," he whispered, so soft Milena could barely hear it, and subsided into peaceful sleep again. Lambert got up and wrapped his arms around Milena. "You're fucking brilliant, you know that?" Milena felt her ears going hot. "It is only that I have a little distance from the problem, I think." Over the next few days, Aiden woke and slept and woke again. Each time he was a little more present, a little more aware. Triss changed his bandages. Eskel asked careful questions. Aiden answered them in fragments, his memory a torn net, all holes and no fish. He remembered leaving Kaer Morhen. He remembered darkness, and chains, and humans bending over him with bright, cruel eyes. He remembered pain. He remembered a room with stone walls and a single lantern by the door and nothing else, nothing to see, nothing to distract him, for what might have been days or weeks or months. He remembered a woman's voice saying, "Run," and then running, gliding, drinking out of muddy pools, eating a rabbit raw, following the sunrise with a sort of blind, helpless desperation. He did not remember faces. He did not remember names. He remembered Jad being there, in the dream, in the darkness, and the memory made his stomach turn. And then, 5 days after he was brought in, Aiden opened his eye fully for the first time, and saw Lambert leaning over him, and saw the wolf lord behind Lambert, and saw a dark-haired human woman he did not know standing in the corner with a basket of food. "Are you real?" he croaked. "Sure as hell hope I am," Lambert replied. Aiden took a deep breath, smelled home, smelled safety, smelled love. He was real. He was really here. Triss examined him. He assessed his own injuries with the clinical detachment of a wolf-blood trained to do so. Broken leg, broken fingers, cracked ribs, flayed feet, an ache at each wrist and ankle where the manacles had bitten in, at least 3 deep cuts across his torso. And the eye that did not respond to light. The eye that was, in all likelihood, gone forever. He would heal. But he would heal. And Milena fed him porridge spoonful by spoonful because his splinted fingers could not hold a utensil. She told him terrible jokes to make him laugh, and then winced when the laughter jarred his ribs. She brought him water in a spouted cup. She sat beside him and embroidered while he slept, her needle flashing in the lamplight, a quiet, steady presence in a room full of worry. And Aiden, who had spent 3 years in a stone room with nothing but pain and silence, looked at this small, dark-haired, impossibly gentle woman and thought, with a bewilderment that was almost funny, Lambert married her. My Lambert. My prickly, foul-mouthed, impossible Lambert married this woman. And she was feeding him porridge. And she was smiling at him, as she smelled like roses, and she did not smell afraid. "Well," Aiden said, swallowing the last spoonful, "you are definitely the clever one," Milena giggled. "Why, thank you, kind sir." And somewhere in the room, Lambert made a soft, almost wounded sound, and Milena turned to look at him, and their eyes met, and the whole room smelled like pine and roses and something warm and golden that Milena could not name but recognized all the same. The sword above the mantel gleamed, and the mountain held them all. The weeks that followed were a slow, stubborn, glorious reconstruction. Aiden healed the way wolf blood do, which is to say, faster than any human could fathom, but slower than he wished. His fingers were the first to come back. The splints peeled away on a Tuesday morning with Triss humming over his hand and pronouncing the bones knitted well enough to bear gentle use. His ribs followed, the cracked ones knitting into stiff ridges of scar tissue that ached when he laughed too hard or reached too far. His feet took longer, the flayed soles rebuilding themselves layer by patient layer until he could press his weight against the floor without wincing. His leg, the worst of the breaks, was last, and even then it healed crooked enough that Triss had to reset it once, which meant one more afternoon of biting down on a leather strap while Lambert held his shoulders and murmured apologies that sounded more like prayers. And his eye never healed at all. Triss examined it one morning with careful, gentle fingers, tilting his chin this way and that, and finally shook her head. The pupil did not respond to light. The gash had cut too deep, severed something that could not be reknit even by the wolf blood draft's extraordinary gift. Aiden lay very still on the cot while she told him, and then he laughed. It was not a good laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has spent 3.5 years in a stone room with nothing but pain and silence and the slow erosion of his own mind, and who has decided that if he does not laugh, he will scream, and screaming is worse. What good is a one-eyed wolf blood, he said, not to anyone in particular. Aubrey, sitting in the corner with his enormous hands folded in his lap, said in a voice like gentle thunder, "Little cousin, there is no shame in weeping for what is lost." And Aiden wept. He wept until his throat was raw and the bandages across his face were soaked through, and Aubrey held his head and hummed a low soothing note and did not look away, and Lambert stood in the doorway with his fists clenched at his sides and his jaw locked so tight the muscles jumped beneath the scar, and Milena sat in her chair with Bluebell in her lap and her hands twisted in her skirts, and no one said a word because there were no words that could fix this. But afterward, when the tears had dried and Aiden had blown his nose and laughed again, this time a real laugh, small and crooked but real, he said, "All right, what's next?" And that was the thing about Aiden. He grieved, and then he moved forward. He learned to braid Milena's hair, because it gave his fingers something to do while they remembered how to be clever, and because Milena's hair was silk soft and smelled of rose oil, and she sat very still while he worked and hummed little tunes that made him feel like he was back in a world where things made sense. He learned to judge distances again, throwing the ball against the wall and catching it, first with both hands, then with one, then while turning his head so his blind side faced the bounce. He learned to walk without crutches, first one lap of the corridor, then 2, then 5, then the stairs, then the training yard. Each small victory tasted and savored like a man who has been starved for 3 years, finally allowed to eat. And every morning he woke with Lambert's scent in his nose, because the sachet of hair and cloth was strung around his throat, and every night he fell asleep with Milena's heartbeat against his arm, and the kitten purring somewhere nearby, and the whole room smelling of pine and roses and the warm bread and honey sweetness that meant love. He was not whole. He would never be whole again, not entirely, not the way he had been before the stone room and the chains and the bright cruel eyes of men who wanted answers he could not give. But he was alive, and he was here, and he was loved, and that, he decided, was enough to build a life on. It was Milena who solved the tangle of 3 hearts, though she did not know she was solving it until the words were already out of her mouth. They had been talking, the 3 of them, in the sitting room with the fire banked low and the kittens asleep on the hearth. Lambert was on the floor with his back against Milena's chair, and Aiden was in his own chair with his legs stretched out and his fingers working a scrap of wood into something that might become a bird or might become kindling, depending on whether his hands cooperated. They had been circling the subject for days, dancing around it the way wolf blood danced around a fire, never quite stepping into the center. Milena said, very quietly, "My father kept a mistress. Most Redanian noblemen do. The wife looks the other way, and the matter is not discussed." Lambert made a noise of disgust. Aiden's knife paused on the wood. "It is not the same thing," Milena continued. "Not at all. A mistress is a secret, a shame, a thing hidden away. What you and Aiden have is not that. It is not lesser. It is love, plain and open, and I will not pretend it is anything else." She took a breath. "And I will not ask you to set him aside. I could not, even if I wished to, which I do not. How could I, when he has helped make you who you are, and who you are is the man I love?" Lambert turned to look up at her, and his eyes were very bright. "But neither will I pretend I do not feel the sting of it," Milena said. "So I propose this. Aiden and I will share you. Not because I am generous, and not because I am resigned, but because I want this. Because I love you, and I love him, and I want us all 3 to be happy, and I think we can be, if we choose it freely." The room was very quiet for a long moment. Then Aiden set down his knife and the scrap of wood and looked at Milena with his single green eye and said, "You are the cleverest person in this entire keep, and I am not saying that as flattery. I am saying it as fact. You saw the shape of this before either of us did." He swallowed. "I will share him with you, and it will be a fucking honor." Lambert looked from one to the other, and then back again, and his face did something complicated and wonderful, a sort of disbelieving joy breaking through the last of his worry, like sunlight through storm clouds. "I say," he said, and his voice cracked a little, "I say you are both too fucking good for me, and if I can have both of you, then I am fucking greedy enough to take it." "Good," Aiden murmured. "Good," Milena whispered. And Lambert got up from the floor and kissed Milena, soft and sweet and tasting of the tea she had been drinking. And then he turned and kissed Aiden, harder, hungrier, biting at his lip until it bled a little. And Aiden made a low, pleased sound in his throat and grabbed the front of Lambert's tunic to pull him closer. Milena watched, and she did not look away, and she did not feel jealousy, and that surprised her almost as much as it delighted her. When Lambert finally pulled back, breathing hard, Milena leaned down from her chair and pressed a kiss to Aiden's forehead, chaste and gentle, the way one might kiss a dear friend or a beloved brother. Aiden blinked up at her, startled, and then his mouth curved into a smile so warm it made her chest ache. "Sealed with a kiss all through," she said. Aiden caught her hand clumsily in his healing fingers and pressed his lips to her knuckles. There we go, Milena agreed. And that was how it was done. No ceremony, no priestess, no golden ribbon. Just 3 people in a firelit room with 2 sleeping kittens and the smell of pine and roses and honey, choosing each other freely, in full knowledge of what they were choosing, and meaning every word. The days after that were strange and sweet and full of small adjustments. Aiden moved his cot into their bedroom because he slept better with Lambert's heartbeat near enough to hear, and Milena did not object, and Lambert cried quietly in the sitting room one night while Milena held his hand, and Aiden pretended not to hear from the other side of the door, and the next morning, all 3 of them ate breakfast together and did not mention it. Lambert braided Aiden's hair because Milena had taught him how, and he was determined to master it, and Aiden sat very still and made rude comments about Lambert's technique until Lambert threatened to shave his head, and Milena laughed so hard she had to put her porridge down. Aiden taught Milena to play cat's cradle with a bit of ribbon, and Lambert watched from his chair with his arms crossed and his expression deeply skeptical, and then tried it himself and got his fingers tangled so thoroughly that Milena had to cut him free with her little sewing scissors. And Aiden howled with laughter, and Bluebell attacked the fallen ribbon. Milena embroidered eye patches for Aiden, 3 of them, one with the cat sigil and silver thread, one with a pine bough for hope in adversity, and one with a single variegated tulip, because Aiden had looked up the flower's meaning in Milena's book and insisted it would amuse him. "Beautiful eyes," Lambert said, staring at the tulip patch. "You want me to embroider a flower that means beautiful eyes on the thing covering the eye you cannot see?" "Yes," Aiden said, looking extremely pleased with himself. "It is a joke that only I will fully appreciate, and that makes it the best kind of joke." Lambert shook his head and muttered about cats being absolutely unhinged, but he wore the tulip patch the next day, and the day after that, and Milena caught him touching it gently with his fingertips when he thought no one was watching, and she understood that it was not just a joke. It was a small, fierce, tender act of refusing to let the worst thing that had ever happened to him be the whole of his story. And at night, in the big bed with the furs and the firelight and the purring kittens, Milena would wake sometimes to find Lambert's arm around her waist and Aiden's hand resting on Lambert's chest, all 3 of them tangled together in a knot of warmth and breath and slow heartbeats, and she would lie very still and listen to them breathe, and think, "This is my life now, and it is good, and it is mine, and I chose it." It was a beautiful day. Milena would remember that afterward, the way the light fell through the leaves in the little clearing at the western edge of the keep's grounds, dappled and golden, the breeze just cool enough to keep the summer sun from growing too warm. She and Aiden had gone out for a walk, he on his crutches, she at his side, because he had said he needed to be outside, needed to feel the wind in the grass and the open sky after so many weeks of stone walls and banked fires and the smell of healing salves. They had reached the clearing where she and Lambert had picnicked once, months ago, the one with the little cliff at its edge and the view over the plains of Kedwin that stretched away to the horizon. Aiden had leaned on his crutches and breathed in deeply and smiled and said, "Fuck, look at that view." And then someone behind them said, "It is a beautiful view. What a pity it will be your last." They both turned. Jazz stood in the center of the clearing, flipping a dagger in one hand and smiling a thin, nasty little smile. Milena felt the blood drain from her face. She knew Jad. Everyone in the keep knew Jad. He was the cat who had been with Aiden on the hunt 3 years ago, the one who had come home without his brother, the one Lambert could not look at without his hands curling into fists. He was competent and quiet, and he smelled like nothing. Not fear, not anger, not joy. No. His emotions had been sanded down to a blank, unreadable smoothness that made every wolf blood in the keep uneasy, though none of them could say exactly why. What the hell? Aiden said. Jad shrugged. You are the most annoying brother I have. First, you could not learn the recipe for the draft despite being mated to the fool who redesigned it, and then you escaped. And then you did not even have the decency to die of your injuries. He shook his head. Vizimir paid astonishingly well for his very own wolf blood to interrogate. You have been a sore disappointment to him. Melena's stomach dropped. Vimir, the king of Redania. Her king. You are lying, Aiden said, but his voice was thin, and his hand had gone white-knuckled on the grip of his crutch, and Melena could see the tremor running through him, the old terror rising like water in a well. I am not, Jad said pleasantly. I was the one who brought you to him, knocked you out, and handed you over like a parcel. The treaty was a ruse from the start, you see. Vizimir never wanted peace. He wanted an excuse for war, and your dear little treaty bride was meant to provide it. He glanced at Melena. You were supposed to die, my lady. So that Vizimir could claim the wolf blood had broken their word and march on Keedwin with a clear conscience. No, Melena whispered. Girl up, Jad said. Only you did not die. You thrived. You sent letters home saying how happy you were, how kind your husband was, how welcome the wolf blood had made you, and that was very inconvenient. Vizimir could not declare war if the treaty bride was writing home that she was having a lovely time. So you decided to fix that, Aiden said. His voice was steadier now, but only barely. Melena could hear the effort in it, the way he was forcing himself to stand upright, to keep his breathing even, to not let the memory of the stone room and the chains drag him under. I did, Jad said. The plan is simple. You go cat mad, a berserker rage, and in your frenzy you slaughter the treaty bride. I arrived too late to save her, and am forced to put you down. The cats will believe it, the wolf blood will believe it, and Vizimir will have his war. No one will believe that, Aiden said. They will, Jad said. Rumors are powerful, and no one will be alive to contradict them. He stepped forward, and the dagger in his hand caught the sunlight. I do hope you will cooperate, my lady. It will be easier if you do. And then he moved. He was fast. Wolf blood fast, cat fast, faster than anything Melena had ever seen outside of Lambert and Aiden at full strength. He crossed the clearing in 2 strides, and his free hand shot out and closed around Aiden's throat, slamming him backward. Aiden's crutches clattered to the ground. He went down hard, one knee buckling, the other leg still half-healed and not strong enough to bear his weight, and Jad was over him, the dagger raised, and Aiden made a sound, a high, thin sound of pure terror, and Melena saw the blade coming down, and she did not think. Not a word, not a cry for help. A sound, high and shrill and piercing, the sound Zofia had told her about weeks ago, the sound that wolf blood could not bear. It tore out of her throat like something ripped loose, and Jad flinched. His hand went to his ear, his eyes squeezed shut, and the dagger in his other hand wavered. And then it fell. Clattered to the grass, spinning, glinting. Melena's hand was already moving. She had practiced this motion 100 times in the sala with Lambert, and 100 more with Aiden, drawing the blade from its hidden sheath beneath her skirts, the leather harness warm against her thigh, the hilt settling into her palm like it was made for her hand. She stepped forward. Jad was still stumbling, one hand clapped over his ear, his eyes still shut, his face twisted in pain. He was wolf blood. He was faster than her, stronger than her, sturdier than her. In a fair fight, she would not last 3 seconds. But this was not a fair fight, and he had hurt Aiden. He had held Aiden down on a stone table for 3 years. He had sold him to a king who wanted to break him open and read the secrets of his bones. And now he was going to kill them both, here in this sunlit clearing, and make it look like madness, make it look like Aiden had lost his mind and slaughtered his own lover's wife, and no one would ever know the truth. Melena brought the dagger up and around in a smooth arc, exactly the way Lambert had taught her, exactly the way she had practiced in the salle until the motion was written into her muscles and her bones. The blade went into Jad's heart. It slid in so easily it did not feel real, like pushing a needle through silk, like parting a curtain. There was a small sound, a soft, wet sound, and then Jad's eyes opened. He looked down at the dagger in his chest. He looked up at Melena. His mouth moved. You bitch, he said. And then his hand shot out and closed around her throat. The world went white at the edges. Malena clawed at his fingers, at his wrist, at anything she could reach, but his grip was iron, was stone, was the implacable crushing strength of a wolf blood who was dying but had not yet realized it, who still had one last spasm of terrible power left in him. She could not breathe. She could not breathe. She kicked, she twisted, she reached for her second dagger, but her fingers could not find the hilt, and Jad was dragging her down, down, his weight pulling her toward the edge of the clearing, toward the little cliff, and she could feel the grass giving way beneath her heels, could feel the ground crumbling, could feel the empty air waiting below. No, she choked. No, no, no. And then an arm wrapped around Jad's throat from behind. On his feet somehow, one crutch discarded, his bad leg trembling under him, his good hand locked around Jad's neck in a grip that shook with the effort of holding on. He hauled backward, and Jad staggered, and his fingers loosened just enough for Malena to tear herself free. She toppled backward. Her hands scrabbled at the grass, at the dirt, at the crumbling edge of the cliff, and the soil gave way under her fingers, and she slid, and the sky tilted, and she was falling, falling, the wind screaming in her ears, and she reached up desperately for the edge and found nothing, nothing, nothing. And then a hand closed around her wrist. She hung there, dangling, staring up into Aiden's single green eye. His face was white, his teeth clenched, his arms shaking with the effort of holding her. His bad leg was buckling beneath him. His ribs, still half-healed, screamed with every breath. He should not have been able to stand, let alone hold her weight. Catfish, he said, his voice ragged. Malena. Aiden, she whispered. And then, far away, coming fast, a voice she would know anywhere. Malena. Aiden's arm gave one final heave, and Malena's free hand found the edge of the cliff, and her fingers dug into the grass and the dirt, and she pulled, and Aiden pulled, and she was up, up, over the edge, rolling onto the grass with Aiden collapsing beside her, both of them gasping, both of them shaking, both of them alive. Behind them, Jad lay in the grass with Malena's dagger in his heart, and a thin line of blood at the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were open and empty, and he was not moving anymore. And then Lambert was there, dropping to his knees between them, his hands on Malena's face, on Aiden's shoulder, checking, checking, his eyes wild and his breath coming in ragged gasps, and Colin was right behind him, and the world filled with voices and hands and the smell of fear and blood and grass. It's over, Malena said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, far away. Quinn, gone. It's over. He's dead. I killed him. Lambert pulled her into his arms so hard she could barely breathe, and she buried her face in his neck and shook, and Aiden leaned against her other side, his forehead pressed to her shoulder, and the three of them knelt in the grass in the golden afternoon light, covered in dirt and blood, and the terrible residue of what had almost been, and held each other. And the mountain watched, silent and vast and indifferent, as it had watched everything for 1,000 years. But it held them. It held them all, and that was enough. The treaty was void. There is a difference, and it mattered, because a broken treaty implies two parties who once honored their word and then chose not to. A void treaty means one side was lying from the very first stroke of the quill. Vizimir of Redania had never wanted peace. He had wanted a pretext. He had wanted a noble daughter dead in Kaer Morhen, so he could point at her corpse and cry betrayal. He had wanted Aiden strapped to a stone table for 3 years, so he could wring the secret of the wolf blood drab from his screaming throat. He had wanted a war he believed he could win, because a traitor in his own ranks had whispered that wolf-blood could be defeated, that one captured warrior proved an army could be broken. The traitor was Jad. Jad was dead, and now the Wolf Lord was coming. The council of clan heads met in the war room beneath Kaer Morhen's great hall, a low-ceilinged chamber carved from living rock, lit by iron lanterns that threw long shadows across the faces of 7 clans. Geralt stood at the head of the stone table. Eskel stood at his right hand. Lambert stood at his left, because Lambert had killed a king's envoy in a courtyard 3 days ago, and the blood on his hands had not yet dried. Not in his own mind, at least, and he needed to be where the fighting would be thickest. Geralt did not shout. Geralt never shouted. His voice was quiet, gravelly, the sort of voice that made you lean forward to hear it, and in that quiet he said the only words that mattered. We go to Tretogor. We end this. And the wolf blood answered with a single word, a word that was not a word but a sound older than language, a sound that meant loyalty and blood and the mountain itself. Wolf. The army left Kaer Morhen at dawn 3 days later. Not all of them. Old Keldar stayed to guard the keep, and Barman, and a handful of elders who could no longer run the miles the march would demand. But 230 wolf blood went down the mountain in the gray light before sunrise, their boots striking the stone in a rhythm like a single vast heartbeat, their swords and daggers gleaming, their medallions catching the first pale gold of morning. Lambert ran with the vanguard. He ran because running was easier than thinking, because if he stopped moving, his mind would drift back to the rooms he had left behind, to the bed where his wife and his lover were sleeping, to the sachet of his hair around Aiden's neck and the wooden pendant Milena wore against her throat. He ran because if he thought about what might happen if he did not come back, he would turn around, and he could not turn around. Not this time. Not with Vizimir still breathing. The army did not take the road south. The road south was what every human army expected, the broad highway through Kedwin and over the border into Redania's farmlands, and Geralt had no intention of marching into the teeth of prepared defenses. Instead, the Wolfblood turned north and west into the mountains themselves, following the great arc of peaks that curved along the edge of the civilized world like a spine. Humans did not go into the mountains. Humans looked at the blank spaces on their maps, marked with crude drawings of serpents and the words, "Here there be monsters," and they stayed away, which was exactly why Geralt chose the mountains, because no one would be watching. No scouts, no patrols, no warning bells, just wolf blood and stone and the endless sky. They ran at night and slept during the day, in hidden hollows and beneath the shelter of overhanging cliffs. They ate what they carried and what they hunted, deer and mountain hare, and once a very surprised ibex that Dragonfly brought down with a thrown knife at 40 paces. They did not light fires. They did not need to. Wolf blood eyes saw in the dark as well as any cats, and wolf blood bodies ran hot enough to ward off the mountain cold. Lambert ran beside Cone on the third night, the griffin's pale hair catching the starlight like a ghost's. They ran in the easy silence of old brothers, shoulder to shoulder, the miles falling away beneath their feet like water. "Your lady," Cohen said at last, his voice low and even, barely audible over the wind. "She will be well." "Gay!" "I know," Lambert said. "She is not fragile, Lambert, not in the ways that matter." "I know," Lambert said again, and this time it was true, and the knowing helped, a little, like a salve on a wound that would not fully close until he was home again. On the fifth night, Lambert caught the scent of something bitter and musky on the mountain air, and his hand went to his sword. Synyxes, small snakes, no longer than his hand, patterned in the mottled brown of dead leaves, but their venom was the most powerful dissolving agent in the natural world. A bite from a seps would eat through bone. Even wolf blood healing could not save you. The only cure was to cut off whatever the snake had bitten, and if the bite was somewhere you could not cut, you died slowly, or you died quickly by your own blade. Lambert found the seps coiled on a fallen log, its tiny head raised, tongue flicking. He drew the undersea into his shield and struck, fast and clean, the glowing blade shearing through the snake's neck before it could strike. The carcass fell to the ground in 2 pieces, and Lambert stood over it breathing hard, the copper smell of venom sharp in his nostrils. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt nothing at all except the cold mountain wind on his face, and the distant sound of his brothers running ahead of him, and the knowledge that every mile between him and Milena was 1 mile too many. On the 8th night, they reached a ridge directly north of Tretogor. Lambert stood at the top of the ridge and looked south, and there it was, spread out below him in the moonlight like a jewel scattered on dark velvet. The city. The palace. The hunting park behind the palace with its endless winding trails and its tame deer. A vast and stupid piece of landscaping that had been designed for royal amusement and would now serve as a highway for 230 wolf-blood warriors. Eskel spread a map on a flat stone and marked the routes with a piece of chalk. Small groups of 4 or 5 entering the park from the north, spreading south through the trees, converging on the palace walls. The palace guards would be watching the roads, the gates, the main approaches. They would not be watching the trees. They would not be watching for shadows that moved like smoke and struck like lightning. Lambert memorized his route. He did not ask who he would be fighting. He already knew. He had known since the moment Jad's blood cooled on his hands in the courtyard of Kaer Morhen. Vizimir was his. Vizimir had kept Aiden in chains for 3 years. Vizimir had sent Milena to Kaer Morhen expecting her to die. Vizimir had looked at a treaty and seen only a knife to hide behind. Vizimir was going to die, and Lambert was going to be the one holding the sword. They went down the ridge in silence, 230 shadows flowing south through the darkness, and the mountain watched them go, silent and vast and indifferent, as it had watched everything for 1,000 years. But it held them. It held them all. They entered the hunting park an hour before dawn. The park was vast and dark, and full of the soft sounds of sleeping animals, deer curled in the undergrowth, birds stirring in the high branches. The wolf blood moved through it like water through stone, silent, unhurried, each group knowing its route by heart. Lambert ran with Dragonfly and Theo and Bran, four shadows among shadows, and the only sound was the whisper of their boots on dead leaves and the steady rhythm of four wolf-blood hearts. The palace walls rose out of the darkness ahead of them, tall and pale and studded with iron gates. Guards walked the ramparts in pairs, halberds on their shoulders, their lanterns swinging in slow arcs. They were bored. They were expecting nothing. Why would they expect anything? The wolf-blood was supposed to be in Cadwin, weeks away, locked behind their mountains like the monsters the rumors said they were. The wolf-blood were not in Kaedwen. The wolf-blood were here. Lambert scaled the wall. He did not need ropes or grappling hooks. He needed only the rough stone, and the strength in his fingers, and the memory of every cliff he had ever climbed in the mountains north of the world. He went up like a cat, silent and swift, and over the top and down the other side before the nearest guard had finished turning his back. Dragonfly followed, then Theo, then Bran. And then there were 20 more wolf-blood dropping from the shadows, their swords drawn, their eyes catching the lantern light and glowing gold. The palace doors were iron-bound oak, 12 feet tall, carved with the Redanian royal crest. Lambert kicked them open. The sound echoed through the corridors like thunder. Somewhere deep in the palace, a bell began to ring, a thin, frantic sound. Too late, far too late. Guards came running, fumbling with their halberds, their faces white with shock. Lambert knocked the first three down without drawing his sword, the flat of his blade against their helmets, the butt against their knees. He did not kill them. Geralt had said capture, not kill, and Lambert obeyed his wolf lord even in his fury. But he was going to kill Vizimir. Geralt had said that too. The ones who hurt our kinsmen will die. And Lambert had a name for the one who had hurt his kinsman, and that name was Vizimir. And it was written in 3 years of Aiden screaming, and in the bruises on Melena's throat, and in the hollow look in the cat's single green eye when he woke from nightmares he could not remember. The throne room was at the heart of the palace, a vast cavernous space with vaulted ceilings and pillars of pale marble, and a floor of polished stone that reflected the torchlight like dark water. And there, at the far end, on a throne of gilded wood and crimson velvet, sat Vizimir of Redania. He was a small man. That was the first thing Lambert noticed, and the thing that surprised him most. The man who had held Aiden in chains, who had sent Melena to die, who had plotted a war he believed he could win, was small and sallow and thin-lipped, dressed in cloth of gold and ermine, his crown sitting slightly crooked on his head. He looked like a toad that had swallowed a lemon and was not enjoying it. And he was not alone. Behind him stood a row of men in fine clothing, his council, his princes, his grandsons. And to one side, on a low chair, sat a woman with dark skin and dark eyes and an expression of perfect, terrible calm. Adelina, Melena's friend. The queen who had opened a cell door in the middle of the night and whispered the word, run. Lambert saw her. Adelina saw him. And something passed between them, a recognition, a debt acknowledged. Lambert gave her the barest nod. She inclined her head in return. And then the fighting began. The guards in the throne room were braver than the ones in the corridor. Or perhaps they were simply more desperate. They formed a line before the throne, halberds lowered, and shouted challenges that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. The wolf-blood did not shout back. They simply moved forward, a tide of steel and silence, and the guards broke. Not all of them. Some fought, and fought well, and Lambert respected that, even as he knocked them down. Some threw down their weapons and fell to their knees, and the wolf-blood bound their hands and stepped over them. And some ran, and the wolf-blood let them run. Because Geralt had said the ones who fled were not guilty, and Lambert obeyed his wolf lord even when every instinct screamed at him to chase. Cohen led his troop around the melee and straight to Adelina, 4 griffins with drawn swords forming a wall of steel between the queen and any danger. Codden went down on one knee before her, sword sheathed, and spoke to her in a voice too low for Lambert to hear. Adelina nodded. She did not run. She did not faint. She sat on her low chair with her hands folded in her lap and watched the end of her husband's reign with the same terrible calm she had worn when she opened the cell door and said, run! Vizimir tried to flee. He shot off his throne with a speed that surprised Lambert, for a man so small and so sallow, and bolted for the doors behind the dais, his ermine-trimmed robes flapping behind him, his crown sliding off his head and clattering on the stone floor. Lambert was between him and the door before Vizimir had taken 3 steps. The king stopped. He looked up at Lambert, and his eyes were wide and wet and full of a fear so raw it had its own smell, bitter and sharp, like urine, which, Lambert realized, was appropriate because Vizimir had pissed himself. The smell of it rose between them, mingling with the copper tang of blood and the smoke of torches, and Lambert almost laughed. You cannot do this, Vizimir said. His voice was high and thin, the voice of a child who has broken something precious and is trying to convince the adult that it was not his fault. I am a king. I am anointed. You cannot touch me. You kept the wolf blood chained to a table for 3 years, Lambert said. His voice was quiet. He did not need to shout. You tortured him. You broke his bones and cut his flesh and left him in a bare stone room with nothing but the dark. You did that to one of mine. I wanted information, Vizimir said, and his hands were shaking, his fingers splayed at his sides like he was trying to ward off a blow. The draft. The draft. The recipe. If I had known how to make more wolf blood, I could have defended my kingdom. I could have protected my people. You could have asked, Lambert said. Eskel signed a treaty with you. A real treaty. We would have honored it. We always honor our word. You could have asked, and we would have talked. But you chose chains instead. You chose a stone room and a knife and 3 years of screaming. Vizimir's mouth worked. No sound came out. And then you sent me a wife, Lambert continued, and the words came out harder than he meant them to, sharper, edged with something that was not quite rage and not quite grief, but lived in the space between. You sent me a 19-year-old girl and expected her to die. You expected me to be the monster your rumors said I was. You expected her to be broken, or used, or killed, and you expected to stand over her corpse and cry betrayal and march your armies north. She was a pawn, Vizimir whispered. She is my wife, Lambert said. And she is alive. And she is happy. And she killed your traitor with the knife I gave her because he tried to take her from me, and she will not be taken. Not by you. Not by anyone. He drew his sword. The blade caught the torchlight and gleamed, a long, clean line of steel, and the undersea hummed in it, a low golden glow that made the shadows in the throne room flinch. Vizimir fell to his knees. He clasped his hands together. Go ahead. Lambert did not hear the begging. Or rather, he heard it, and it meant nothing to him, because begging was what Vizimir had not allowed Aiden to do. Aiden had begged. Aiden had screamed. Aiden had broken and bled and broken again, and no one had come, because no one knew, because Jad had told them Aiden was dead, swept down a river, gone forever. Lambert raised the sword. Geralt, he said without turning around, I am taking his head. Geralt was standing in the middle of the throne room, surrounded by bound and kneeling nobles, his white hair catching the torchlight, his golden eyes watching everything with the calm of a man who has already decided how this ends. He looked at Lambert. He looked at Vizimir, groveling on the stone floor, his fine robe stained with his own fear. Do it, Geralt said. Lambert brought the sword down. It was clean. It was quick. It was, Lambert thought, more mercy than Vizimir had ever shown to anyone. The head rolled a short distance across the polished floor and came to rest against the base of a pillar, and the body crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut, and the throne room went very, very quiet. No one screamed. No one fainted. The bound nobles stared at the place where their king had been, and their faces held not grief, but something closer to relief, the relief of prisoners when the cell door opens. Adelina, on her low chair, closed her eyes. A single tear tracked down her cheek, and then she opened her eyes again, and they were clear and dry and free. Lambert cleaned his blade on his sleeve and sheathed it. His hands were steady. His heart was steady. And somewhere deep in his chest, in the place where 3 years of grief and fury had knotted themselves into something hard and dark, the knot loosened. Gone. It would never be entirely gone, but loosened. Enough to breathe. Enough to go home. Geralt stepped forward, over the body, past the throne, and stood in the center of the room where every eye could find him. He did not sit on the throne. He did not look at it. He looked at the assembled nobles, the bound counselors, the terrified princes, and he spoke in that quiet gravel voice that made you lean forward to hear it. Your king is dead, he said, and his line with him. But I will not rule Redania. I did not come here for a crown. I came here for justice, and justice is done. Tomorrow your new monarchs will take their thrones, and I will sign a new treaty with them, a true treaty, written in honest words, and then I and my kin will leave, and the peace between our peoples will be restored. He paused. Let the silence fill the room. Let it settle into the stone and the bone and the blood. Go home, he said, and do not make me come back. The nobles went. They went quickly, and they did not look back. Lambert stood in the empty throne room for a long moment, looking at the place where Vizimir had knelt, at the dark stain on the stone that would not scrub clean. And then he turned and walked out, because there was nothing left here for him. Nothing but blood and the smell of fear and a throne he did not want. He had a wife to go home to. Ergo. And a lover. And a kitten that would probably be sitting on his pillow. And a bed that smelled of roses and pine and honey, and 2 heartbeats he knew better than his own. He walked out of the palace and into the dawn, and the dawn was gold and cold and clean, and the mountain was waiting far to the north, patient and vast and indifferent. But it held them. It held them all, and Lambert ran towards it because he was going home. The army came home on a morning so bright it seemed the mountain itself was celebrating. Malena stood on the steps of Kaer Morhen with Aiden beside her, leaning on no crutch now, standing tall and proud with the silver thread of his eye patch catching the midday sun. They had been waiting for 2 weeks, counting the miles the wolf blood would have to cover, and now at last the first runners crested the ridge, and the whole keep erupted in howls of joy. Lambert came bounding up the steps 3 at a time, and swept them both into an embrace so tight that Malena squeaked. Aiden hugged back just as hard, thumping Lambert on the back with a strength he had not possessed when the army left. Malena snuggled against Lambert's chest, tucking her head under his chin, clinging to his tunic. Everything smelled of pine and roses and honey, and the tension of the last 2 months drained out of the world like water from a broken vessel. They went inside. They ate. They bathed. And that night, in the big bed with the furs and the firelight and Bluebell purring on the pillow, the three of them came together in a way that was not merely physical, but something closer to prayer. Malena felt Lambert's hands on her waist and Aiden's mouth on her throat, and the whole room filled with the scent of love so thick she could taste it, warm as bread fresh from the oven, sweet as summer honey. And when it was over, when they lay tangled together in the dark, breathing slowly, Malena whispered into the quiet, "I love you both," and felt two hearts answer hers in the steady rhythm of their beating. In the days that followed, something settled, not into stillness, for nothing in Kaer Morhen was ever truly still, but into a shape that fit. Aiden began to spar with Lambert again, properly, in the salle, and then out on the training fields. His missing eye made him slower at first, and he missed handholds he would once have caught without thinking. But day by day, the gaps closed. Lambert stayed on his blind side in paired drills, and Aiden learned to trust that coverage the way he trusted his own breathing. Within a month, he was beating Lambert 2 bouts out of 3. Within 2 months, he was holding his own against any pair in the keep. Malena went back to her mornings in Eskel's office, sorting the diplomatic correspondence that flowed in from every kingdom bordering Cadwin. The treaty with Redania was void. A new one would be written, and Malena would help write it, because Eskel trusted her with the words, and Geralt trusted her with the intent, and that trust was the thing she held more precious than any medallion. And in the evenings, the three of them gathered on the hearth. Malena embroidered. Lambert flipped a dagger and told stories about wyverns and Illyrians in the time he dyed Geralt's hair pink. Bluebell and a second kitten, a tiny black and white puffball named Catastrophe who belonged to Geralt and Eskel, wrestled on the rug, and the whole room smelled of pine and roses and the warm bread and honey sweetness that meant love. It was on one such evening, 3 weeks after the army's return, that Aiden set down his whittling knife and said, very quietly, "I made you something." Malena looked up from her embroidery. Lambert looked up from his dagger. Aiden held out a small object, no larger than a coin, carved from pale birch wood and polished to a sheen that caught the firelight. It was a cat's face, snarling, facing right, the twin to the silver wolf that hung around Malena's throat. "You don't have to wear it," Aiden said, and his voice carried a nervousness Malena had never heard from him before. "But I thought, if you wanted, a mark. From me. So you'd carry both of us." Malena set down her embroidery very carefully. She reached out and took the pendant in both hands, cradling it like a kitten. The wood was warm and impossibly smooth, every edge perfect, the grain of the birch used to give the carved cat the appearance of stripes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Lambert leaned over from his chair, examining the pendant. "Fucking gorgeous," he said, and then looked at Malena with an expression she could only call hopeful. "Would you be offended if you wore it along with mine?" "Not even a little," Malena said. "I would like it very much, seeing both your marks." She smiled. "Knowing I belong to both of you." Aiden made a small, strangled sound of happiness. Lambert rumbled something low and pleased in his chest. Malena unhooked the chain from around her throat, the silver wolf and the golden wedding ribbon, and threaded the wooden cat onto it. She fastened the necklace again and looked up at both of them. The wooden pendant nestled behind the silver one, nearly hidden, but there, present, a shadow behind the light. Aiden reached out and traced the arc of the chain against her throat with one gentle finger. Malena laughed quietly. "Kiss me then," she said. Aiden bent and kissed her, slow and soft, and Lambert watched with an expression of such pure, unguarded joy that Malena felt her heart might break with the beauty of it. When Aiden pulled away, Lambert leaned down and kissed her too, tasting of ale and firelight and the particular sweetness that was only him. "Sealed with a kiss all through," Malena murmured, echoing the words she had spoken months ago in this very room, when the three of them had first agreed to share what they shared. Egerton grinned. "There we go." There we go, Lambert agreed, and pulled them both closer, and the fire crackled, and the kittens purred, and the mountain held them. The letter from Marika arrived on a gray morning in late autumn, carried by a pigeon that landed on the windowsill of Eskel's office with an air of great self-importance. Milena read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at Eskel, who was watching her with that quiet, patient attention she had come to think of as the most genuinely brotherly thing about him. She wants us to visit, Milena said. A formal visit with Geralt and Eskel and a proper escort. Marika and Dawid want to sign the new treaty in person, and they want me there. Eskel nodded slowly. Makes sense. You're the bridge between us. Always have been. Always have been, Milena swallowed. Going back to Tretogor meant walking into the place where she had been a spare daughter, a political pawn, a girl who bit the inside of her cheek until it bled because she was not allowed to show fear. It meant seeing the palace where she had learned to smile while her heart screamed. But it also meant seeing Marika, Adelina, and it meant walking into that palace not as a sacrifice, but as a woman who had chosen her own life, who carried daggers beneath her skirts and a wolf's mark at her throat, and the love of two extraordinary men at her back. I'll go, she said, and so they went. They went. The journey south took 5 days, the Wolfblood army reduced to a proper escort of 23, Geralt and Eskel riding at the head, Cone and Cedric and Axel at the rear, and Milena between Lambert and Aiden with the autumn wind in her hair and the road stretching out before her like a ribbon unspooling. She saw Tretogor from the top of a hill in the late afternoon light, and it looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically, of course. The palace was still vast, still sprawling, still a chaotic jumble of architectural styles added by generations of kings who each wanted to leave their mark. But the fear she had once felt looking at it, the crushing sense of being swallowed by something vast and indifferent, was gone. In its place was a mild, almost fond amusement. It looks like a mess, Lambert said, grimacing at the mismatched columns and clashing stonework. My sense of aesthetics is offended. Milena laughed. Adorable, she said, and kissed his cheek. Lambert's ears went red. Egan cackled. They were met at the palace gates, not by soldiers, but by Marika herself, who abandoned all courtly protocol and threw her arms around Milena with a force that nearly knocked them both over. Oh, my darling, Marika breathed against her hair. You look absolutely wonderful. So do you, Milena said, and meant it. Marika looked tired. Yes, she was barely 2 months out of childbed and carrying the weight of a kingdom on her shoulders. But there was color in her cheeks and a spark in her eyes, and when she smiled, it was not a court mask, but a true, broad, unguarded grin. Inside the palace, in Marika's private receiving room, away from the formalities of the throne hall, Milena met her sister's infant son for the first time. Little Stefan was a tiny, perfect, utterly unimpressed creature who grabbed at Geralt's fingers with solemn concentration and burbled when the wolf lord dangled his hand above the baby's face. Geralt went down on one knee beside the bassinet, his pupils blew wide. He made a soft, wondering sound. May I hold him? He asked, looking up at Marika with the best pleading eyes Milena had ever seen on a man who could kill a king with a single sword stroke. Marika blinked. Of course, my lord. Geralt lifted the infant with infinite care, cradling him in the crook of his arm, and looked down at him with an expression that anyone in the world would have called a smile. Little Stefan stuffed a fist into his own mouth and gurgled. Hello, little nephew, Geralt murmured. Marika put a hand to her mouth. No! Eskel chuckled. He is. Lambert is our brother, and Milena now our little sister, which makes you our sister, and this fine lad our nephew. Milena watched Geralt hold the baby and felt something warm and steady settle in her chest. This was her family. Not the blood that had sold her, but the choice that had kept her. The formal treaty signing took place the next day in the throne room, with Marika and Dawid seated on matching thrones, and Geralt standing before them in full wolf lord dignity, which mostly meant he looked deeply uncomfortable and wished he were anywhere else. Eskel handled the actual words. Milena stood at Geralt's right hand, because that was where she belonged, and when the treaty was sealed with wax and ribbon and the sworn oaths of both parties, she felt the last thread of the old knot unravel. The old treaty had been a cage. This one was a door. That evening, at a smaller, less formal dinner, Milena sat beside Marika and Adelina and Aiden and Lambert, and the conversation flowed easily between them. Adelina told Aiden about the white cat that had led her to the cellar where he was held, and Aiden went very still and very quiet, and then he said, "The clan spirits," in a voice full of wonder, and promised to tell her everything he knew. Cohen sat beside Adelina, and the way he looked at her, with that quiet, courtly devotion that Milena recognized because she had seen it in Lambert's eyes 100 times, made her heart ache with a gentle, second-hand joy. And then, because the evening was not yet complete, Marika turned to Milena and said, very softly, "Father sent word that he has fallen ill." He and Mother and Marta will not attend the festivities. Milena nodded. Mare! She had expected as much. Her father, who had sold her to monsters for a crown. Her mother, who had looked away. Marta, who had wanted to be queen and would have gladly let her youngest sister die for it. I have not written to Mother, Milena admitted. Marika reached over and squeezed her hand. I know, darling, and I do not blame you. Milena looked at her sister, at the woman who had become queen, not through ambition, but through circumstance and grace, who had written letters full of love and worry when their father had written letters full of duty and silence. Thank you, she said, for writing to me, for telling me the truth, even when it was terrible. You are my sister, Marika said simply. I will always tell you the truth. And that, Milena thought, was enough. That was more than enough. They stayed in Tretogor for a week. Melina danced with Dawit at the formal ball and watched Lambert and Aiden dance together and scandalized half the court by kissing her husband on the dance floor. She held little Stefan and cooed at him and whispered that his auntie would teach him to embroider when he was older, which made Marika laugh until she cried. She walked the gardens with Adelina and talked about embroidery and flower language and the strange, sweet, terrifying man who wrote her letters full of compliments no Redanian nobleman would ever think to offer. And on the last morning, as the Wolfblood saddled their horses in the stable yard, a young man with floppy brown hair and very blue eyes came tumbling through the door, laden with bags, and announced that he intended to accompany them to Kaer Morhen and write songs about the Wolfblood. Geralt stared at him. Eskel stared at him. Lambert sniffed the air and raised an eyebrow. He's not lying, Lambert said. Possibly out of his fucking mind, but not lying. The young man, who had declared his name to be Jaskier the Bard, beamed. Every king needs a court bard, he said brightly. And Eskel told me you don't have one, which is just absolutely unacceptable, so I am volunteering for the position. Geralt looked at Eskel. Eskel looked at Geralt. A long, silent conversation passed between them in the language of raised eyebrows and tiny shoulder movements. You can come, Eskel said at last. Just try to stay out of trouble. I make absolutely no promises, Jaskier said cheerfully. Lambert fell over into a hay bale, laughing too hard to get up. Aiden rolled his eyes, hauled Lambert upright, and slung him over his horse like a sack of grain. Melina shook her head and smiled. First to the bend in the road gets a kiss, she called, and nudged her palfrey into a trot. Behind her, she heard Lambert yell something profane, and Aiden whoop with laughter, and the thunder of hooves on packed earth as her two beloveds spurred their horses after her. Eskel rode up beside her, shaking his head. You have learned to manage them, he observed. Yes, Melina said, contented. The trick is loving them wholeheartedly. So it is, Eskel agreed. And Geralt, on her other side, rumbled a low, warm chuckle. So it is, he said. And, little sister, you do it very well. Melina smiled and turned her face to the morning sun and rode east towards the mountains. Towards the cold, plain, welcoming halls of Kaer Morhen. Towards the hot springs and the training fields and the hearth where the kittens wrestled and the fire crackled and 2 heartbeats waited for her. Towards the sword above the mantle and the sword in her hand and the medallion at her throat. Towards the life she had built, stitch by stitch, kiss by kiss, choice by choice, out of terror and trust and the stubborn refusal to let fear have the last word. Gonga. The mountain rose before them, vast and patient and indifferent, as it had risen for 1,000 years and would rise for 1,000 more. It did not care who climbed its slopes or what stories they carried. It held them all the same. And Melena de Rogovin, who was no longer de Rogovin but of Kaer Morhen, who was wife and lover and sister and friend, who had braved the thorns and found the rose, rode towards it with the wind in her hair and love at her back, and did not look back. She did not need to. Everything she needed was ahead.